here we are. I'm Tom Osman, and this is Whatever Comes Next, the podcast where I explore the world of underground and independent music making. And on today's episode, I am talking with writer, musician, editor, publicist, Howard Wuelfing, who earlier this year released Descenes and Discords, an anthology on DiWulf Publishing. A book which brings together facsimiles of every edition of two fanzines that Howard was writer and editor for back in the late 70s, early 80s in Washington, D.C. The first of which was embedded within the underground DIY community of the time. And the second, which was a sort of expansion of the view of this community into other underground communities in the US. And this is a great story for anybody who is interested in underground music and DIY music of the past decades, particularly here focusing on that era in the late 70s, early 80s. But interestingly for me, my relationship with Howard goes back a couple of years to, in fact, covering Swan's new album at that stage, Birthing, where I also got the opportunity through Howard to talk to Michael Girard for the first time, which was very exciting for me. In fact, every outlet that I currently write for or do podcasts for, whether it's this podcast, New Noise Magazine, Ghost Cult Magazine, Every Album with Mike and Alex, Howard has facilitated interviews and reviews for all of them. So I'm very grateful for that. There are a number of, I think maybe 7 or 8 episodes of this podcast, which came about thanks to Howard. So that was how I first knew him. And then I subsequently discovered that he had this whole history within underground DIY music circles going back into the 70s. So it's a fascinating story and a great valuable insight into Howard's view of underground music in the US at that time and beyond. You can go to DiWulf Publishing at DIWULF.com to get hold of the book. There are a range of other cool punk DIY underground books that you can get hold of there. I believe they also have some merchandise that you can buy from them. You cannot buy it from the terrible plague of locusts that shall not be named in this introduction. One of the bands that Howard was in during the early 80s in Washington, D.C., Under Heaven, recently in the past few years, I think in 2021, started making music together again. And I'm going to play one of those tracks at the end of this interview with a little clip coming up just now. I, as you can possibly hear, have a cold. I also have a broken toe, which you can't hear, but I can feel it. And this is the last episode with a new interview that I'm going to put out this year. I've been powering through them, and it is time for a break, but I am planning to put out some extra little bits and pieces and bonus content in the next week or two. It's also a good moment for me to finally get off Spotify, to get onto AmpWall, to do some other bits and pieces, to sort out some other things in life. But I think this is a really cool episode to end the year with, not only because it's a fascinating story, but also because Howard has been very supportive of this podcast and his impact is spread out, sprinkled around. And just more generally, the fact that he's a person who is committed to underground, DIY, independent, interesting music. And that really feels like very much in the spirit of this podcast and exactly the kind of person that I should be talking to and covering. So thank you, Howard. I hope that you will enjoy this episode, everyone who is watching or listening to it. You can follow me at Tom Osman Sounds. You can go to my website, tomosmansounds.com, for my music. You can go to patreon.com/whatever comes next for some extra content. And that is that. So, Howard Wuelfing, author of Descenes and Discords, an anthology. Take it away.
Good
Hi,
to meet you.
it's good to meet you in real time as well. So we're here largely to talk about Descenes and Discords, an anthology which you released back in August.
Yes,
But
sir.
I think it's interesting to put things into a context for people listening and watching who may or may not know our working relationship, because I think it kind of indicates your trajectory in the music world, because you started out in terms of what we're going to talk about with the book in DC, covering DC music, which broadened out with Discords. And now you, as a publicist, for me, have set up a variety of different interviews, which, in a sense, if we take, for example, a duo like Charming Disaster that you set
Correct.
up for me, if people listen to Charming Disaster and listen to Minor Threat, they might say, well, musically, there doesn't seem to be much that they have in common. But on the other hand, it's still an example of underground DIY musicians. And so it feels like everything that you've been doing, or at least from what I've seen, is still kind of carrying on in that spirit, even if the style of music has changed or evolved over all these years.
Uh, yeah, I would agree. Finally, when it comes to choosing what clients to take, and by and large, I don't do outreach. I don't go looking for work. Just people come to me for some reason, and I try to determine whether I think there's someone I can do something for or not. By and large, sometimes there's someone I have a relationship with, or it's a friend of a friend. And since I'm independent and I don't answer to a boss, I can do things based on personal whim. And my whim is sometimes it's just because it's for personal reasons. It's relationship stuff. And by relationship stuff, I don't mean necessarily business relationships, but people who respect me, I respect them, and they want me to do something and I feel I can, and I say yes. Otherwise, it's just hearing something that makes me think, okay, I haven't heard that before. Cool. Which to me is sort of at the core of my taste. Here's something I haven't heard that before. What the heck is this? That's what always engages me. And, that's one of the reasons why most of the artists I work with are, in fact, all of them are not mainstream. It's a pretty diverse palette from, Cajun and Creole to old school funk to, avant-garde music. Is just all these things that make me think, wow, I've never heard that before. What an interesting idea. Cool.
So then, stepping pretty far back, then, if we go back to before your fanzine writing, or at least what we're going to be talking about today. So I understand that you moved to DC in the mid 70s. You moved from New
Yes.
Jersey. So give me
Mhm.
a bit of context for that time. What was your sort of involvement in the music world, whether it was playing music or covering music at that time, and what took you to DC?
I have played and written about music since I was a tween. I did it in high school, both of those things. I did it in college. Um, I was writing for occasionally for places like the Village Voice in New York, Cream Magazine, Zoo World down in Miami from fairly early on. When I say writing for them, I was not staff. I was not a main writer. I was an occasional contributor, but it was pretty heady stuff to me because, I once I got onto music, I loved music and I loved writing and I loved writers and I wanted to be that. But I also played from an early age. Had classical piano lessons for a number of years and then wound up playing bass and just doing normal like high school kids stuff and then college kids stuff. Well, some of it wasn't that normal. Thinking back on it, when I was in college, my main band was kind of like a glitter adjacent, very gay friendly outfit that was doing like girl group songs and Broadway musicals, just because we felt like it, just because it was interesting to us, and did a lot of weird things. Like I still have the New York Times clip somewhere playing the first gay dance at Princeton University because we were the only band that would do that because we had the appropriate repertoire and stuff like that. So I'm in college. Basically, the short version is my girlfriend at the time says, "So what do you want to do with your life?" I'm like, "Well, I guess I'm going to law school because I got all these things in the mail from places saying like, come do law school here. Here's some money. You could do that." I'm like, "I want to be a rock writer. That's what I want to do." "Well, if we move to DC, I'll get a day job and you can try to do that." And so we did.
So I think, you've touched on writing for Cream magazine, for example. So I remember, I think my first exposure to music writing was the NME in
Okay.
the UK, and I would have been about 13, 14. So I specifically kind of remember that I think the first edition I was shown was where Oasis were being featured for the first time. So it would have been about 1994. And funny thing for me is that I sort of took a lot of stuff at face value back then. Like I would just read the text, and
Right.
I didn't really kind of like think about the tone. And it was only much later, like I've forgotten now the name of the author, but I read this great book that was sort of chronicling music writing over the last 100 years. And one of the
Right.
things they talked about was how sarcastic the British writers of the 90s were. And it was only when I read that I thought, oh, yeah, that's right. Like I remember
Yes.
interviews with people that seemed very kind of dry and almost sort of like disrespectful. So another thing that I
Mhm.
wasn't really aware of until much later was sort of the lineage of, sort of like high profile rock writers like Lester Bangs and Nick Kent and people who maybe lived as much of a rock and roll lifestyle as the people they were covering. So how much was that?
Or Richard Meltzer,
Yeah.
a name that people forget, and yet he's probably Richard Meltzer and Nick Tosches are probably the great granddaddies of that kind of gonzo journalism, i.e., that you're chronicling what you are living, which is your immersion in this lifestyle.
And how much would you say that that had an impact and was an inspiration for you?
100%. Those my heroes. Especially Meltzer and Lester Bangs. I remember having a couple phone conversations for him because I was aspiring that I would like write for Cream magazine. And I think at one point they're like, "Yeah, you could do that." And I did like an interview with like one of their New York correspondents, and they were like, "Well, yeah, just come out here and hang with us for like, a couple weeks and we'll figure this out." And I'm just like, okay, I'm a college kid. Like, well, how am I going to get out there? And like, what am I going to live on? And it seemed like a little bit too amorphous. So I didn't do that. But, I had these conversations and probably have a note or two from Lester, very encouraging. And he was always really gracious on the phone, considering I was like a pesky kid. I mean, he was wonderful. But they were a big inspiration. And the British press was. I mean, I think I was most immersed in the British press and Enemy mainly. So it always seemed to me like they had the sharpest writers, and I loved the sarcasm, which was very evident to me from the start, because that attitude of, we're not worshiping you. We are people. You're a music lover who makes music. I'm a music lover who writes about it. We're relatively equal finally as human beings. And so I'm going to treat you like you're a friend of mine. And, I'm a snotty guy. I totally, love that. I did notice that also it seemed like, at least at a certain point, that British music coverage followed a particular arc. Find someone that no one's heard about, say, none of you have heard about this. This is the greatest thing ever. And if that group succeeded, to then say, like, yeah, they were great up to a point. Now they're just treading water. It was an interesting cycle to observe because when you realize it's happening, you see it happening again and again and again. But still, it doesn't mean the writing isn't good.
Yeah.
But you have to filter the information and know what you're going to take from it.
Yeah. So I think it's in your foreword in the book where you talk about coming to DC from New Jersey, and you'd had some exposure to a kind of nascent punk scene or sort of new wave music that was inspiring you, and you came to DC and you're a bit disappointed that you saw a lot of covers bands. So when did you first start to identify some exciting music that was coming out in DC, and how did Descenes actually start?
Well, when I got to Washington, the first thing I did, of course, was to start checking out every record store in town, because that's what you did. In those days, that's where the knowledgeable people were, that were where the freaks were, that's where, your tribe was going to be. So I'm running around to these places, and, I was already on record company mailing lists from college and had learned about trading in records so you can get more records. And I'm running around town saying like, hey, do you guys buy promos? And there's one guy goes, are you a rock writer? And I'm like, sort of. And this guy was a rock writer for Cream named Gordon Fletcher. He was at that point, maybe still now to a degree, one of the few black rock critics out there. And he was a pretty prominent one. So I was mighty impressed and shocked to like run into this guy, like in DC. And we, became friends. And one night he calls up and says like, oh, there's a punk show happening, up at this place called The Keg up on Wisconsin Avenue. That's north of Georgetown, of that neighborhood. Do you want to go? Like, okay, let's go. And it was, the archetypal dive bar, not a faux dive bar. And this was a real dive bar. It smelled bad. I mean, the drinks were cheap. The management were incredibly disrespectful to everyone who was there. It was a true dive bar. And I saw this band called Overkill, who, to my recollection, basically played covers, but they were all incredibly obscure covers. So back in the day, you'd have covers bands, but you'd call them show bands, and they played popular hits of the day. So Overkill, and then the Slicky Boys, another band around that time, I may have seen them at that same gig, or I saw them soon thereafter, also at the Keg. They played mainly covers. They might have one or two originals, but all the covers were like just insanely obscure. Like Overkill would play In Joe's Garage by Brute Force. If you want to look up Brute Force, look up King of Pho, Brute Force, go down that wormhole. Years later, I wound up doing publicity for him, which was like a mind blower. I'm just like, dude, do you realize like in Washington, D.C., in the punk scene, you were a hero. You were like a hero to all of us. This and Tapeworm of Love, those are like the greatest songs ever. And he was like, okay, if you say so. The King of Pho, check it out. And yeah, I thought, wow, this is great. There's something here. I mean, maybe it's only one place and maybe there's only two bands, but there's something great. And shortly thereafter, this guy named Steve Lorber, who had a radio show called Mystic Eyes on WGTB, I think it was, in Georgetown. It was like a total garage rock obsessive radio show. And of course, that's DNA for American punk rock, is garage rock. He was kind of managing the Slicky Boys. He had gotten them a residency, I guess playing weekly on a crappy night of the week at the Keg, and the Slicky Boys broke up. And Steve didn't want to waste the work he did, so he offered it to a band I was in called The Look. And we took it over. And, we played like 3 sets a night, I guess, for, I don't even know anymore, like a span of months. Could have been a year, could have been less. It's a long time ago. And that was sort of the gathering place for the early DC scene. I mean, most of the people who came on a regular basis all wound up forming bands, eventually. Just because once you see that someone else is doing you were thinking of doing, you think, okay, if I do this, there's a point to it. I can play out. These guys are doing it. We can do it. And it kind of went from there.
Yeah. It's fascinating to think of being at this kind of ground zero moment for something that then years later people look back on, and it's kind of, you get documentaries being made about the DC scene, left, right, and center.
Yeah, punk the capital.
And on that topic, so in the conversation that you have with Ian MacKaye at the very beginning of the book, you talk about punk. And I was wondering to myself, because I've brought this up with people that I've interviewed who were making music back in the 70s or the 80s. How did you sort of see this scene at the time? I mean, I think, if I remember right, the term punk was already being thrown around in the 70s. So but I've seen at certain points as well, you talk about new wave music, and I feel that maybe at the time, maybe those things were kind of interchangeable, like it was a way to talk about something that was new. So how were you kind of conceptually framing this music and this movement at the time?
Conceptually, I was framing this as just an alternative to this very slick, super popular music that, that controlled the airwaves. The songs are too long. They're all incredibly predictable, as mainstream pop music is. That's the nature of it. It's supposed to be familiar, calming, soothing. It's like background noise or something you memorize instantly, as opposed to something that makes you stop and say, what the heck was that? Something with a twist to it, something that's unpredictable. So this was part of a move towards that. As I said, when I was still living in New Jersey, the New York started out as like, I don't know if they actually use this as the term. You'd have to ask someone like Lenny Kaye or Patti Smith who were there at the time, but they were people playing loft parties, television, Patti Smith, et cetera, and then they moved into some clubs like CBGB's, Max's Kansas City at a certain point, Great Gildersleeves, and other places that are mainly forgotten. But they were playing songs, well, except for television, of course, that tended to be shorter. They tended to be more sort of, they'd absorbed the lessons of garage rock, of being sort of catchy and yet surprising. And, it was taking place there. And to me, that was punk. It also partook of sort of the beginnings of DIY culture, because this is my take on it. There's a relatively recent idea that in the United States, you've got this whole generation crap, the greatest generation, the silent generation, the boomers, Generation X, et cetera, all those years being a little bit off, but maybe capturing something about, well, it's myth in the end. And myth in the end, the job of myth is to give you like a holistic idea of what people experience, how they experience their place in their environment. So this theory came up that there's the last batch of boomers, and they call them Generation Jones. And for Generation Jones, here's a theory. This is the theory and my experience. Were the first generation, let's make this really clear, pretty much white, middle class, educated people for whom it was apparent that the American dream was not going to be happening. It wasn't this quick, well, if you do these things, you will wind up here. You'll be in the suburbs, white picket fence, wife, 3 kids. You're going to work for the same company until you retire, and then it's easy street until you croak. it was clear to us that was not going to happen because of what was happening in the country. There was a recession, gas crisis, all sorts of stuff like that. And just the job market shifted. And so suddenly college graduates were like working in copy shops and stuff like that. And so there's a sense that like actually the system doesn't really work. And the system doesn't really care about us necessarily. So if we care about stuff, it's up to us to make this stuff work. If we want to play music in a club, okay, here's a horrible dive bar. Let's talk them into letting us do that on a crappy night. So we understand this is a bad deal, but we're setting it up for ourselves. We are going to try to make it work. And being as DIY as possible. You know, the fashion sense originally was it's all thrift store because, well, you're broke. You're broke, and also your choices are wider because it's not what's on the racks at a mass merchandiser like Macy's or something like that. It's 50 years worth of like fashion things that you can pick and choose from. And that was the initial batch of punk. And then, of course, you hit that point where the Ramones are signed. They go to England. And this is my perception. I'm an American. The British say, like, that's really cool. We can do that. That's punk. And then you get British punk, which all sounds like the early stuff, at least to a large degree, to me, very much influenced by the Ramones and the New York Dolls. As well they should be. Those are two great bands. Those are two of the greatest American bands that ever existed. Well, rock bands that ever existed. And then young Americans see that, and it's like, oh, okay, cool. Now there's a tribal uniform. We're going to do that. That's what punk is, and this is what it means. We're going to do that. And that winds up being hardcore punk in the United States. A sort of it's a more focused idea of what this culture is going to be, as opposed to the earlier version of punk, which was a lot more sort of eclectic, very DIY, and just kind of catch can in some ways.
Now, I do want to talk about the sort of the evolution into hardcore, but I think that's sort of taking us into the point where Discords started. So I want to remain on Descenes for a bit longer.
Okay.
One of the things that I was very interested in and appreciated when I was looking at the first issue of Descenes, you've got this sort of mission statement where you say that your aim is to promote fun in the great Washington, D.C. area by lending whatever support we can to the formation of a vital, ongoing community of excited rock and rollers. We will expose local acts and publicize local clubs and provide a forum for local opinion. So there are three particular things that stand out to me from that.
Uh-huh.
The mention of fun, the mention of community, and being a forum for local opinion. So how did you formalize that sort of idea of what you wanted to achieve?
By putting it in that editorial.
Maybe
No, I mean that's the point where we make it formal, because otherwise entertainment, which is what this is, whether it's high art or not, it's still entertainment. That's inherent in the whole thing.
I guess perhaps what I mean is more, how did you come up with that notion? Because I feel like the sense and the importance of community is something that I'm coming to appreciate and understand, and comes up more and more when I'm interviewing people.
Right.
And I sort of get a sense of alternative underground DIY music, and partly from what you were saying as well, as being it's a reaction. There's a certain, whether conscious or not, there's a certain inherent protest to that, in that you're sort of rejecting the establishment. And maybe that was part of the reason why the fun aspect really stood out to me, was that it's not so kind of po-faced, and it's not so self-important. But then again, I guess this is a movement of young people, so fun is important.
Right. It is. I don't know that I can really expand on that because it seems to me that's just sort of a primary statement that this is what entertainment's about. I mean, in some ways, the community part is a different thing. And that stems partially from like doing this in DC, because DC at that point was notorious for being a place where no acts got signed out of DC. They didn't do it. If they did, they had to, they had to move somewhere, LA or New York. That was it. If you want to make it, you move to one of those places and you play for the record companies, get a deal, et cetera, et cetera. And this was a conscious effort looking at New York, where it was clear that there was a whole strata of bands that they just played New York. That's what they did. They played local clubs. They didn't have record deals. They're just playing. They're just playing because they wanted to play and people liked them. To sort of recreate that and having it and understanding you can't take this for granted. You're building like an ecosystem of fans and bands. Bands are playing for less so that fans can afford to get in. Fans are paying money and buying booze so that the bands have a place to play, for instance, on the simplest level. Some venues are being open to this and supporting it. Some are not. And it's saying we're just going to put our resources towards the people who have the same ideal. We just want to have fun. To a degree, we're creating a folk music, a music that you're playing for your community because you want to entertain them. I mean, because that's what, in the end, that's what folk music is. It's not about style necessarily. It's not even about a repertoire necessarily. It's about how someone functions. So, Lead Belly, people like that. I mean, that's why they're folk musicians. And to me, DC punk wound up being a folk music in the end. I mean, the most famous bands out of DC at this point in time, I mean, I could name who was famous back in the day. It was Nils Lofgren, Bucks, Angel, Charlie and the Pep Boys, Root Boy Slim. No one's ever heard of those guys except for Nils Lofgren, maybe. They say Fugazi, Minor Threat, stuff like that. People who never went to a major label.
Yeah, indeed.
People who just focused on, we are going to do this here on our own terms. I mean, Discord's pretty infamous for like, it's all DC bands.
Yep.
Really, or sometimes Baltimore. But, they basically took that idea and really made it work and really leaned into it. And that's been an amazing thing. As to the forum part,
yep.
I mean, it's kind of a lofty way of putting it. More importantly, it's important to understand that, we're putting these things out there. We're not sitting in an office 400 miles away doing this shit. I mean, we're writing about this band in this club, and then we're in that club seeing that band like a week later, and they're just like, if they didn't like what they saw, they're in our face complaining. Yep. And we're listening. There's a dialogue. It is a forum. We're saying what we feel, but we expected that people were going to respond. And one of the things we were doing is, we encouraged and let musicians write about other musicians. I mean, I think the first review of the Bad Brains that exists was by Kim Kane of the Slicky Boys, who saw them play, a basement somewhere. And even though the Slicky Boys, notoriously a garage, hardcore garage rock band from day one, he like loved it. He thought it was brilliant and said so in print. That's the first review of them. And me writing about people, it's like it went back and forth. So it was an open forum. If anyone said like, I'd like to write about these guys, it'd be like, do it. So I've never heard of them. I'm not going to do it. The whole point was to give exposure to people, feeling that was going to be helping get more fans to know about this or that band, but also understanding that it's good to encourage artists by saying, okay, we see you. We see what you're doing. Okay. So they can see their names in print. The little thrill it gives them and the little bit of encouragement, because by and large, it's not necessarily easy being in a band. You're spending money, you're spending time. Typically when you start, playing out, you're playing to 5 people, it's not fun, or it's not easily fun. And we are trying to like inject a little bit more like recognition into the system so that more people would be like, I got to write up in, Descenes, cool. That
And
was a thought.
yeah. And so during that time, so I think for around about 18 months that Descenes was going,
Okay.
you had that community, you had the bands, like as you said, DC bands that weren't going to be getting that major exposure.
Mhm.
You obviously had an important part in that community. You had the people that were the fans that were writing to you, and there was all this kind of interaction that was going on.
Mhm.
Now, I understand, because you talk about this in, I think it's issue 5. At a certain point, there was a disillusionment that came into that. But initially, what was keeping you going? I mean, how much were you making money out of this? How were you sustaining this? No, I don't want to make it out like, the money is all important, but like, you
Yeah.
need, things cost money in order to print or whatever. So
Correct.
yeah, what kept it going?
I was embedded in a small group of people. My wife at the time, Tina, Mark Jenkins, uh, another DC writer who liked to make things happen. Some people just like to do things and make things and see them exist and manifest and just be like things that you should not be able to have to just say, again, it's that DIY thing. It's like, well, we don't have anyone doing this. We're just going to do it because someone should do it. And I guess no one else is going to do it. So we'll do it. I mean, so that was it. That was the main driving force. It's like we took on that responsibility to make this happen and push it forward as long as we could. Sort of on these psychological, emotional level. It didn't make money, but it didn't lose money. I mean, because to me, that was, part of my view of aesthetics is that if you make art that you have to pay for, that is vanity. It should at least sustain itself.
Mm.
So I don't think any of the bands I had, well, the last one in DC, we made a little bit of money. Not a lot, but a little bit, went into my overall revenue stream, as it were. But it was self-sustaining. And if you would see these things, they were photo offsets. So they were printed, I think, at a place that printed the advertising supplements for the Washington Post. So the money we made went to pay for it to exist that way.
Mm.
And that was paid for by the advertisers. So, much love to them because that's why we could do that. And we just gave it away. There was a cover price on it, but the cover price went to the retailer.
Mm.
Because having worked in record stores, I knew that free giveaways sit on the floor by the door. And if it's raining out, people wipe their feet on it, because I saw that happen. And I thought, we'll incentivize these people to put it on the counter because they get the money.
That's good business thinking.
But they got the money. Well, kind of it's good marketing.
Yeah,
though
at
in
least
the
for
end,
exposure.
again, there was no positive revenue stream coming in, but it sustained itself.
So when I started covering music, I started writing for what was, well, they still in existence, Blessed Altar Zine, who originally started out as a print fanzine. And by the time I started writing for them, they were a website, essentially. For people who have grown up in the digital age, Can you give a bit of insight and shed some light on, from a practical point of view, what it was like to have a physical print fanzine? What are some of the sort of practical considerations that people that are just used to, covering music or entertainment in general on the internet wouldn't have had the experience of?
Well, for both of these zines, the way they were produced was various people would like write their stuff up. I believe often in pen on paper. Some people handed in typed things. I'm pretty sure I just hand wrote it. I handed that to Tina, who at the time was working for this thing called the Chronicle of Higher Education, which was a trade magazine for higher education. And she basically would stay late and illegally input all this stuff into their system. She got the production crew in on the scheme. They would print it out in like long reels of type and coat the back with wax. Wait for it. Coat it with wax. She would bring them home. I had a light box, which is just a little shallow metal box with an opaque glass top, and there'd be like fluorescent lights inside it that, so it's illuminating it from the back, and put a layout sheet, which basically was a piece of paper with a grid on it for whatever your image area was, and you'd physically like stick it on the paper. And if it's like, oh, we're gonna have a picture here, then it's like take a razor, cut it, pull it all up, move it down, move this piece here, put in the picture until you had a finished magazine. And because of the technology of doing photo offset print, especially on pulp, all the photos need to be processed. They have to interpolate dots into it, empty dots. Otherwise, you just get this blot. It gets all smeary and blurry. So if you look closely at newspaper photographs, you can see there's actually like a microscopic dot pattern in there, because that's to like open it up. And those were produced at the production offices of the Unicorn Times, which was, let's say, like the Washington equivalent of like Time Out. And Mark Jenkins worked there, and he worked the camera that did that, and he illegally did all our photos and would then hand them to me. So yes, all the basic production facilities were pirated from real companies.
Nice.
And then I did the paste up work, and then we'd run it to the printing plant, and they would run them off, and we'd go pick our 1,000 up, bring them home, and start distributing them.
And how time consuming was that, and how much did that dictate how often you put out Descenes?
It would probably be like a couple nights. That wasn't a big deal.
Okay.
It was more about thinking of a reasonable production schedule where we would accumulate enough copy. Because, we're not paying people, we're not giving people assignments. Things are coming in at their pace. There was kind of an organic pacing to it.
Okay, so there was no sort of specific, we're going to release something every month or 2 months or whatever. It was just kind of...
We kind of had that aim. It could be that, I think we kind of had that aim. So if we had too much copy, we would just hold the extra for the next issue.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense.
But it was pretty organic. And, the pace up, it sounds like a lot, but I had experience doing that. I mean, my first day job in DC was doing exactly that work for the Unicorn Times.
Yeah. And something else which I have the tiniest bit of experience with, but I'm very happy that I've managed to mostly avoid it. When I was a student, I remember I had an interview that I had to do for a particular project, and I had to transcribe it. So I know how long transcribing interviews can take.
Right.
And one of my best friends is constantly mocking me for being a Luddite, because he's always making fun of the fact that I'm resistant and skeptical about various technologies, and I'm resistant towards AI and skeptical. But I have to admit that without Otter AI that I use for transcribing interviews when I'm, writing something,
Right.
it would be so time consuming. So
Yes.
what was that like for you, that time when there was not the technology to transcribe for you and you had to transcribe yourself? How did you do that on a practical level?
Just did it because there was no other options. Even conceptually, there are no other options.
So you just have
You
like
just
a tape recorder, you'd play a bit, you'd write it down,
Yeah,
you'd play the next bit.
had a cassette machine, and if things weren't intelligible, you'd have to go over it again and again and again. I did that for years because, besides producing these fanzines, I wrote for other publications, for years and years and years. Your Flesh, Forced Exposure, Spin Magazine, Washington Post, that was all live reviews, so there was no transcription there. Concert Magazine out of Philadelphia. It's not something you even thought about because there weren't any other options. That was just part of the gig.
Yeah. Bridging the gap between or getting to the end of Descenes and moving on to Discords. So talk to me a bit about the disillusionment that led to the winding up of Descenes, and then the 7 or 8 months before you started Discords and how you went into that new fanzine.
Well, you could see from the initial mission statement, that the intention was to basically create a community for a city that we perceived as underserved for having original live music, and that we are encouraging everyone to think about the whole scene first and foremost. If you're a band, you start getting gigs and you're scoring the gigs, and they say so we can give you an opener, or you could choose the opener, that you always choose the opener. And you think of who needs it, as opposed to, well, what's another big band so we get a full house? It's just okay, who's coming up that needs exposure, that you would do that sort of thing. There was a feud in town because one club was excluding people who were not of drinking age from playing, which a certain contingent of which I was a member held was illegal. But, DC is one of those towns fairly corrupt. So it's whoever's got the money is dictating, the scenario. And, we basically called for a boycott of that. At one point, put together an alternative music festival for everyone who couldn't play that club. And that was largely populated by bands that were either A, too weird, or B, they weren't old enough. And most of the first batch of hardcore bands all played that. At least one, I was told, one called Government Issue, reputedly formed just so they could play that festival. See, that's that thing where there's an opportunity, they're encouraged to okay, I can do that. There's a reason to do that. So this is what we were really leaning into. And we saw some of the original punk bands we come up with, they were leaning into, nah, we don't want to really do that. We want to get a deal with a big record label. We want to tour. We don't really care about this DC scene. And that caused the disillusionment. Now, this shows my myopia at the time, because I'm just thinking well, this whole thing has failed. This view of how a music scene should exist, it's failed. No one else is buying in. Because I was looking at my contemporaries, and within 6-7 months, all these people about 10 years younger basically enacted those same values, and that's the DC hardcore scene. Everything I just said, they did all the time, matter of course. So I should have held out for another 6 months, but I didn't. And I just, at that point, just changed sort of perspective to, well, this is what we experience here in Washington as a place that people just don't consider, they don't consider the local music scene. It's unrecognized. They deserve more attention. There must be other places that have the same issue. So let's start looking at all these different places that no one really, the major critics and major, record companies pay no attention to. Boston, Detroit, Minneapolis, uh, New Jersey, Pittsburgh, Madison, Wisconsin, Olympia, Washington. I'll note that a number of these places along the ways afterwards wound up being like a big deal because this whole phenomenon of underground scenes coming to the national prominence became like a thing in the United States, where it was like the Hoboken scene in New Jersey. So it'd be like the Feelies and the DBs and the Bongos and a bunch of other bands like that. Or it would be, the Boston scene and Mission of Burma, Cars, folks like that. Minneapolis, Husker Du, Suicide Commandos, Replacements, Soul Asylum, Pacific Northwest came after Minneapolis. I mean, and there was actually a time sequence of these scenes popping out one after the other. But to really sort of like look at that, and this is kind of like on day one, where those scenes are there, none of them are really breaking out, but they're existing and they're functioning like the DC scene, had been functioning up to that point. And to me, that was very exciting because you could see this network forming of clubs that would book bands with no record deal, or they were like had an indie single out, of indie record labels putting out, mainly singles because that was cheap. You could do that. Bands who wanted to do that would get in a van to quote Henry Rollins, quoting Mike Watt, get in the van and play all these dates for like little or no money just because they wanted to do that. And then fans who would they're like clocking all these things. It's like, oh yeah, that's what I want to see. Who's playing at that club this week? And, the zines that were documenting this.
So in terms of, when you say that there were these scenes, these regional scenes that weren't being represented on a sort of a mainstream or a larger scale, in terms of how you were then aware of these scenes, was that through this underground DIY community that was existing in different places? So you'd know other zines, you'd know bands that would come and tour in different cities, people would write to you and mention bands. Was it a sort of an organic intercommunication like that?
Yes, because there was no other way of communicating. It was, calling telephone directory and asking for a phone number and calling it, or it would be like writing away to someone because that was it. That's all there was. And because that's all there was, people did it as a matter of course. It wasn't something you didn't think like, I can't believe I have to do that. You did that all the time. Your eyes were always open. If you were, if I was in New York City, going I see like a likely looking record store, go in there. If there was like a zine, you'd buy that because that was it. You're not going to find that stuff anyplace else. So you always had to be actively researching, and you take it home and you study it. You're like, and if there's addresses, you're writing people. It's like, hey, you want to swap zines? You send me 10 of yours, I'll drop them up, vice versa. And because the outlets where you could get exposure were limited, people would seek you out. I mean, I just started getting records in the mail from people I'd never met, never heard from, and made a point that when we would review these things, to put their addresses in there, because that's the only way you could find them. The zines and the indie record labels, that was it. They were direct. In the end, there was a function of directory that was in there. Because we're understanding how this works. We're trying to actively play a part in it and help people make connections.
And so in terms of that movement then, what brought Discords to an end?
that marriage ended, and I no longer had access to that production work, and I had more serious things to focus on at that point in time. And happily, soon thereafter, I was mooning around a Sparks concert at the old 930 Club, a rather small place, I may say. And this is Sparks. I couldn't name the album. It's the one with the pink cover where they're dressed as the males are dressed as a bride and groom, whichever
Okay.
one that one is.
They've had a
And that was
lot of albums, so I'm not specifically sure.
and I'll tell you, I'm a lifelong Sparks fan. I saw them when they played America, touring their one, two, three, fourth album. So when they had their first British backing band, that was good. Anyway, so I'm there and I see the rock critic from the Washington Post, and I just punk rock guy. I'm like, what are you doing here? He's like, I'm reviewing this. I'm like, what are you going to say about these guys? You know nothing. You know nothing about them or this music. He goes, you think you could do better? I'm like standing on my head. He goes, good. I'll give me 500 words by tomorrow morning, 10 a.m. Okay. And they didn't print that one, but then they started using me to write live reviews, a couple a week, and did that for I guess for the rest of the time I lived in Washington, D.C. That was trippy.
And how did you get into PR?
The simple version is, so I was playing in my band Under Heaven. I was writing for the Washington Post. I was working full time in a record store in DuPont Circle. And suddenly I became a single parent. And it was clear to me that I couldn't support myself with 3 jobs. I needed 1 job because I needed more free time. And as I was casting around for jobs, my sights were set low. None of the crap jobs I looked for would accept me as being viable. And a salesman I was talking to on the phone, because I worked at a record store, I did buying. I asked him for a sales job, and he said, like, well, we don't have any of those, but we're looking for a publicist. And I'm like, well, what's that? It's kind of funny because at that point I've been getting published for like 10 years at that point in time, but there you go. And he goes, well, you talk to writers and you write a lot. Like, well, I write a lot and all my friends are writers, so I talk to writers. I could do that. I got the job mainly because I underpriced myself by like half.
All right. And so when would that have been exactly?
That would have been 1984. I moved back to Jersey April Fool's Day, 1984.
So with you having been involved in underground DIY music since the 70s, covering music, playing music, and we've talked about this, the importance of community and, on different levels. Now that we are very much in the digital age and there are, the way in which people get exposure is very much changed, but it's like you can get your music, if we're talking about music, from, Glasgow in Scotland over to Japan or India and vice versa. So there's the opportunity there for a kind of exposure that didn't exist before, and people can find out about what you're doing in a way they couldn't before, but now there's so much of it. So
Yes.
do you have a sort of an overall feeling when you look at the landscape, if we're thinking about sort of DIY and underground communities, how do they sort of exist now when you compare to the way that was when you started out with Descenes and Discords?
Well, it always mutates. People always talk about the good old days, and it's like, which good old days? I remember talking about the death of the music industry. I'm like, which one? Because you know what the first big death of the music industry was, right?
Maybe when you tell me.
It was when recorded music supplanted sheet music sales.
Ah.
The music industry was sheet music sales because you'd hear something on the radio, you'd go and buy the sheet music, and then you'd play it on the family piano on Sunday dinner for the whole family. That was the music industry. And recorded music supplanted that. So that was that death of the music industry, so on and so forth. Well, to a degree, we live in an era of potential endless possibility if you really look at what you can do and what you can get away with and how you can do it. But where there's so many sort of presets that exist out there that a lot of people will opt for the presets as opposed to saying like, well, I could do anything, right? Yes, you could do anything. Yes, you can. Saying like, well, I'm going to try to get this on, I'm going to put this on Spotify. Okay, well, that's a preset. You're playing their game. It's fine. There are other things you could do. You could do that instead. So you've got because of the various approaches to how you can find and approach music, different groups elect to follow different paths. I mean, to a degree, because of what I'm comfortable with, let's be honest. It's kind of what everyone does. It's what they came up with, what they're comfortable with. I will always opt to knit together communities of people who actually will meet in real time someplace and do something and look at each other. But that's me, because that's what I came up with. And I've been really lucky that I've gone through a number of iterations of stuff like that. DC was like that, to like just be someplace new and start like you meet this person, they introduce you to that person and sort of accumulate this crew. That was great and that was a privilege and that was a great experience. That happened again for me in Philadelphia because I live like 10 minutes from the northern border of Philadelphia, 10 minutes away. When the whole avant folk thing happened, because Philadelphia had a strong one. Bands like Espers and Ex Reverie and folks like that. And actually, so in a block that now is entirely gentrified, but in that time was like really kind of like down at the heels. Some slumlord had bought like a block of houses, row houses, and gutted them, put in new heating systems, never really insulated them or anything like that, but then rented it all to like all these musicians. So you had like, 5 houses in a row. Everyone was in a band. They were all in the same kind of band. They played on each other's records. They would put on gigs in the backyard that people would basically tour through that backyard. And everyone that you could think of from that era, like Joanna Newsom, Devendra Banhart, et cetera, all played there because that was the Philly spot for that. And because I did Devendra Banhart's publicity from like the day he got signed. He introduced me to those guys, and that was just then you're like embedded in that, and that was great too. I lived downriver from a place called New Hope, which is kind of on one hand, it's the home of American impressionism. Look it up, American Impressionism, New Hope. Phillips Mill, et cetera, and then became this sort of like hippie town. And then it wound up having this like weird little music scene that eventually revolved around a group called Ween. You could look them up. And there's the bar, and there's like that's where all those people that I discussed, they're all there, even now. Gigs every night. So I still exist in that's kind of a space.
Do you know what? I was just thinking to myself, there was some email back and forth between us where Ween came up, and I can't quite remember what the context was now, but
Yeah, Wiener, whatever they're doing now. God bless them. God bless him. I think the Diener's still around here. I'm pretty sure the Diener and the Jeaner, right, Gene. The Jeaners in Woodstock, the Diener's always in this general area, and he's moved back closer. He was on the Jersey Shore for a couple of years, but he seems to be sitting things out and just sort of focusing on getting his head right.
Okay.
It's probably that.
You've seen a lot and you've been in a lot as well. You've been right in the center of a lot.
Yeah, I feel very lucky for that. Some people lead for fairly like boring lives that you just do the same thing from start to finish. Just like people are like, wow, so what was it like being at a major record label? I'm like, oh, yeah, that was okay. Was that the high point of your life? No, not really. Or, oh, what was the DC scene like? Oh, that was pretty cool. Is that the high point of your life? No. It's like the fact that, I've been, just to use a poetic term, blessed to experience a lot of different things, one after the other, each one equally interesting to me. I'm really happy. I mean, now, so like one of my neighbors is Mike Hampton from Funkadelic. I mean, how lucky, I mean, to me, because I'm an old funkhead, how lucky can you be that you live in this weird little blue collar town on the Delaware River across from Trenton, New Jersey, not known as a thriving metropolis, and you become friends with the guitar player from Funkadelic.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's good.
Going back then to Descenes and Discords and Anthology, it came out in August, and I noticed the publisher looks like it's your publisher because I see DiWulf Publishing.
It is not me. It is my wife.
Ah.
Amy Yates Wolfing. It's her publishing company. She formed it because she wrote an oral history of a club in Trenton, New Jersey called City Gardens. And she loves oral histories, especially having read Please Kill Me. That was a big influence on her. And, she got the book agent who shopped Please Kill Me. And he offered her deals, but they all hinged on her making changes to make it, more sort of pop and mainstream. And she just refused and decided to self-publish it. And, having done that, her and the person who wrote some parts of the book, Steve D. Levotico, D. Wolf, said, like, we should do some more stuff. And that's DiWulf Publishing.
And so for people who would like to get hold of the anthology, where can they get it from?
You can't get it from Amazon.
Yay! I fucking hate Amazon with a burning passion.
Yeah. Okay, the simplest thing to do is to go to DIWULF, as in Frank.com. And it's up there with many other fine products, all basically punk rock books. And some merch if you are a merch fiend.
Nice. I like it. Well, Howard, it's been great to talk to you.
Yeah, likewise.
I'm an admirer. I'm really happy that our worlds have interconnected. And thank you so much for the support. You've given me the opportunity to write about and cover and talk to various different interesting people. And I appreciate it greatly. And I'm happy to, at least on the other side of the world, somehow be tangentially within this musical community that you're part of.
Well, and it's only one world. And, with this technology, for all the bad things you could say about it, it allows this to happen. You just have to think about it. Just to end this, when people talk about, the internet and music culture and what that means, I remember years ago, I was working with this lady, Jarboe. She was in the Swans for many years.
I love Jarboe.
And she was a very early adopter of like having an online presence. So, really lean into it. It was really sort of intricate and extensive, and it was great. And she didn't want any promotion or publicity. And after a number of releases, she came to me and said, like, okay, I need to hire you because I've got this space. It's all set up, but no one knows it's there. So there's the trick with all this stuff. You putting it out there doesn't mean anyone will see it because there's so much stuff out there. And so the gig is to figure out ways to let people know it's out there. As I told you, I'm working with Mike Hampton, and so he's playing a series of garage gigs, playing free gigs at people's houses in LA now. And he's got a Facebook page. And the people working with him are like, yeah, I don't get it. It's like, we'll put these things on Instagram and we get 5,000 likes. And we put it on YouTube and we get 10. Why is that? Like, because no one knows it's there. If you put it one place, it's just there. No one's going to bother looking someplace else. You need someone to let people know it's there, which is my job. Let people know it's there. So Monday you'll get a blast with like links, video links to like three of these gigs, not in their entirety, but just see them playing, hanging out, and stuff like that. And hopefully it'll amuse you. It amuses me. They go right into playing "Standing on a Verge of Getting It On," which great song to my mind. That's all.
Very nice. Howard, thank you very much. Until our next interaction, which I believe will be relatively soon, and I look forward to it. Thanks a lot.
Likewise, Tom. Thank you so much for this.